Welcome back everybody to our study of metaphysics. In this lesson what we're going to do is move on to the next major topic within this subject. We're going to talk about the concept of ontology. And what we're going to do is take an introduction to the subject of ontology in this lesson, talk about generally what ontology is, before then looking at the different kinds of categories of ontology and the purpose of expressing ontological commitments. And really, ontology is where we want to begin when it comes to the subject of metaphysics, because in many ways, ontology grounds a lot of our understandings in philosophy, not just in metaphysics. And so it's important that we examine what ontology is and how best we can start to think about the grounding of our understandings of metaphysics and ontological commitments. So, the first question, and probably the easiest question that we're going to have to ask in this lesson, is what is the study of ontology? And ontology is quite easy to define because it is a subtopic within the broader subject of metaphysics, and it essentially concerns itself with the subject of being. What does this mean? Well, you can think of ontology as something of a fundamental building block for broader metaphysical inquiry. And in doing so, essentially what it does is it gives us information about our commitments to truth and reality, how we group objects together on the basis of fundamental characteristics, and essentially the examination of the existence of those kinds of entities, whether they be concrete or abstract. In this way, one may also be able to think of ontology as a subject which almost permeates all of philosophical inquiries, since if we want to strip back any of philosophy far enough, we can have to eventually reach a point where we're talking about ontological commitments. It has important bases, should I say, in all other major branches of metaphysics. And so this is why we are going to begin our study of metaphysics by looking at ontology and examining ontology using a number of different lessons and examining a number of different philosophical theories pertaining to it. Now, because this is an introduction to ontology, and next week we'll start to talk about some of the more detailed understandings of how ontology has been approached by philosophers in the past, talking about, for example, the work of Quine and Quinean ontological commitments. This lesson is going to just talk a little bit more about different types of ontologies which may exist. Ultimately, we delineate the different kinds of ontologies on the basis of their theoretical commitments to various ways in which we can categorize entities which may or may not exist. So the various categorizations are really where we've delineated the different bases of varieties of ontology. And we can explore this briefly in this lesson by talking about, firstly, the idea behind monocategorical ontologies and then polycategorical ontologies. These are the two major broad categorizations and delineations in which ontology is based. So beginning first then, what do we mean when we're talking about different kinds of monocategorical ontologies? Well, these are essentially a variety of ontological theories which posits the existence of single categories by which objects and ideas are formulated. And that's simply it. Given the fact that they are monocategorical, we're talking about single, i.e. mono, categories for which we can delineate and formulate objects and ideas. Polycategorical ontologies, on the other hand, as the name suggests that there are different fundamental ways in which we can categorize different ontological commitments. Polycategorical ontologies, for example, reject the monocategorical perspective. The polycategorical perspective stipulates that at the fundamental level, one can identify a variety of different ways in which we can have commitment to ontological thoughts. Now, essentially, monocategorical ontologies have the advantage of being simpler in being able to essentially delineate between different ways in which one can be ontologically committed to certain propositions or objects. But on the other hand, it is less flexible in its ability to allow for the existence of certain entities and the non-existence of other entities. And ultimately, the inverse is true for polycategorical ontologies, as you would probably understand and imagine. Finally, then, let's think about ontology as grounding. Many philosophers will stipulate that ontology is useful for the grounding of metaphysical and reality-based principles. And on this account, we talk about this idea of having ontological commitments. Now, we're going to get on to talking about ontological commitments in future lessons' time in more detail, and the methods by which some of the most prominent philosophers in this area have established this theory, namely the Quinean method for ontological commitments. But as a basic overview here, the idea of ontological commitments refers to methods by which we commit to being and the existence of things. So to what extent can we fundamentally commit to the existence of certain propositions, objects, and abstract entities? And it is from here that we can build ontological commitments to formulate more substantive arguments in advanced and complex areas of metaphysics and philosophy. This is why ontology is foundational and a fundamental part of study when it comes to philosophy, because essentially we are talking about taking the most fundamental minutiae of existence and finding ways to commit to said existence in order for us to then start to build up our theories of metaphysics more complexly. It also allows us to essentially move away from a kind of ontological nihilistic interpretation of reality, which stipulates that nothing exists and nothing can exist, or there is no way of telling whether or not something exists or not. All of which is very interesting for our understanding of philosophy and useful for debate and useful when we talk about the kinds of ways in which we can verify statements, but not quite very useful when we're talking about other complex areas of metaphysics, like the philosophy of time, for example, and or modalities. Welcome back, everybody, to our studies of metaphysics. We're continuing our examination of ontology. This is the first topic within the broader conversation around metaphysics that we're going to be examining. The previous lesson took an introduction to the subject of ontology, looked at essentially what ontology was, as well as some of the ways in which we can classify different types of ontologies. This lesson is going to introduce arguably the most important of the metaphysicians or philosophers who have spoke on and written about the concept of ontology. This is, of course, Quine. Now, we're going to take quite a lot of time and do quite a few lessons looking at Quinean ontology and looking at the ways in which Quinean metaphysics essentially solidifies one of the most standard and traditional views of ontology within the general metaphysical inquiries. So we're going to take an introduction to Quine in this lesson, talk a little bit about his paper on what there is, and then also talk a little bit in future lessons about his ideas and his processes by which he comes to what he describes as, quote, ontological commitments. And this involves things like paraphrase methods, as well as looking at the ability for you to regiment statements in first-order logic, for example. All of these things we'll explore in future lessons. So, like I said, the previous lesson took an introduction to the subject of ontology, as well as a basic overview of the study of ontology, what ontology essentially is and involves. And like I said, here again, we are going to talk in this lesson about one of the most important contributors to the study of ontology, that being the work of Quine. So, if we remember back to our previous lesson, the study of ontology is at the most fundamental level the study of what there is, what we can be committed to, what kind of ontological commitments we can have in terms of their existence, what there is. According to philosopher Loux, ontology is defined as the study of what there is, as well as a particular theory about what types of entities there are. Now, these are two different things. You might think that these are relatively synonymous in terms of the questions that we're asking, but in reality, they're not, because on the one hand, the study of what there is a relatively broad and all-encompassing question, but the study of trying to theorize and develop a particular theory about what types of entities exist is far more limiting in terms of being able to have ontological commitments. Because if you come to the conclusion, for example, that there is no such thing as abstract entities, it is only concrete ideas that exist, or concrete objects that exist, then you are developing a theory about the types of entities that there are, and you are automatically rejecting the existence of a number of entities that other people might accept. When we talk about the study of what there is, we're talking a little bit more about developing theories to systematically analyze our commitment to the existence of a particular thing. So it is often a subject that takes the form of philosophical questions about what kind of entities exist, what kind of things can exist, what do and what don't exist. And this is really the fundamental, foundational bedrock of metaphysics, because when we study metaphysics, we are going to have to study, firstly, the nature of reality. And one of the things that is part of the nature of reality is the things that fill reality, the things that reality encompasses. So the kinds of objects that exist in reality, like the pencil that I'm holding in my hand, for example. Now, the question of whether or not we can be committed to the existence of these things is a question of ontology. Now, speaking more about Quine, bringing Quine into this conversation, W.V.O. Quine was a philosopher who lived, should I say. That sounds a little bit more sterile to say who existed. He was a philosopher who lived between 1908 and the year 2000, so he died quite a few years ago, a good 20 or so years ago, and most of the modern philosophy on the question of ontology derives out of the work of Quine and his Quinean ontological commitments. And so as a result of which, it would be easy to say that he is arguably one of the most important philosophers in not just the area of ontology, but also in other areas of metaphysics, as well as the philosophy of language, which we're going to get to in future lessons as a separate series in and of themselves. So as a result of which, he was not only a philosopher, he was not only a metaphysician, he was not only a philosopher of language, he was also a logician as well. He made and developed a lot of issues relating to modal logic, for example, which we will get to in future lessons' time as well. I understand that I'm saying we'll get to in future lessons' time, but ultimately when we talk about philosophy, there are so many different areas of philosophy that different philosophers can work in, that means that essentially we have to develop our own set of lessons in all of these different areas as well. So he is credited with new theories of language in terms of the philosophy of language. He is credited with new theories in metaphysics, new theories in ontology, so a sort of substrata of metaphysics, and also new theories within formal logic. And so on this topic specifically, he would develop a method for addressing ontological questions. And so this Quinean method is what is known today and seen today as the modern standard for metaphysics and ontology. You can't study ontology in any great detail without coming across the Quinean method for establishing ontological commitments, which is why I'm going to spend not only this lesson, but also spend a lot of other lessons in the future talking about Quinean methodologies for ontological commitments. Not just talking about them from an acceptance perspective, so not just talking about them with the view that they are automatically true, but also talking about them from a critical perspective, looking at some of the ways in which the Quinean methods and the various aspects and elements of the Quinean methods may or may not have certain values attached to them, if that all makes sense. The views on ontology that he presented himself came from a paper that he wrote in 1948. This was a paper titled On What There Is. And in On What There Is, Quine looks to answer two main philosophical considerations. And it is these two main philosophical considerations that are going to take us into our understanding of metaphysics in the future. He begins by arguing that many philosophers before him have been misled when it comes to issues relating to ontology. This is why we conclude in a lot of instances, for example, that the Quinean method and Quine's ontological commitments theories are seen to be the modern standard because they are so revolutionary, or at least at the time they were so revolutionary compared to that of philosophers prior. He will then go on to develop what he believes to be the correct method to decide what entities one ought to have an ontological commitment to, i.e. what kinds of things one ought to believe in. And by believe in, we mean essentially come to the conclusion that they exist. And we'll get to that in future lessons' time. In the previous lesson, we introduced some of the work and some of the writings in ontology of that of the philosopher Quine. Now, what we're going to do in this lesson is actually start to unpack his writings in more detail, talking about this idea and the proposition that we're going to be discussing of non-existent objects and the ways in which you can have an ontological commitment to a non-existent object. And it's quite interesting because one of the things that you have to think about when you're doing ontology is trying to work out ultimately what you're committed to, as an ontologically committed to, i.e. what you believe to exist. And when we look at things like non-existent objects, you will see why this is such an interesting philosophical problem, and one that Quine likes to talk about it quite a lot in his considerations, specifically in the question of what there is, and his paper, What There Is. He discusses whether or not non-existent objects exist. Now, you might think this is quite counterintuitive, almost paradoxical even, to suggest that non-existent objects exist. But it's not talking about whether or not they actually exist physically, but more so whether or not an individual can be or should be ontologically committed to the truth statement of propositions, which states that a non-existent object exists, or that a non-existent, or maybe a proposition where the statement of the proposition discusses the existence or the properties of a non-existent object or entity. We'll talk in more detail about this concept and how Quine deals with this philosophical issue, because it really speaks to some of the ways in which he approaches ontology more broadly, some of the questions that we're going to explore in future lessons' time. So let's begin then. Non-existent objects. What do I mean by non-existent objects? Well, when Quine wrote his paper on What There Is, he talks about one of the most common ontological viewpoints. That is the view that non-existent entities can exist. Okay, he does so and looks at the following Platonic thought experiment, an argument relating to the existence of non-existent entities. He asks us to consider propositions like the following. So what about this following proposition here? The proposition Santa does not exist. Okay, the statement in its entirety. Now, unfortunately, for those of you who are big fans of Christmas, Santa does not exist. This is a true proposition, okay? But then if it is true, and we can suggest that it is true, because if you're an adult, or if you're not, for those of you who thought it was false, I'm sorry, but it is true. If it is true, then at the very least, it must be a proposition which has meaning. It must be a meaningful proposition, because no proposition which is true can be meaningless. You can't have a meaningless true proposition according to general basic understandings of philosophy of language. And so as a result of which, if it is true, then it is meaningful, at the very least meaningful. If it is meaningful, if the proposition is meaningful, then it must be the case that each part of the sentence itself has meaning. So not only is the proposition in its entirety something that has meaning, but the component parts of the proposition must also have meaning. So Santa does not exist. Each of those individual component parts must have their own individual meaning in order for the proposition as a whole to have its meaning in general. Because this speaks to the argument that you can't derive meaning in a sentence from meaningless contributions to the sentence. So if everything in the sentence is meaningless, then you can't all of a sudden make meaning from that proposition. That is debated, obviously, in philosophy. Don't forget that this is metaphysics, so all of it is debatable. But it is interesting how that is how essentially we kind of think about meaningful statements and how statements have potential meaning. Now, if that is the case, therefore, that the proposition is meaningful and it must be meaningful in the case that each part of the sentence has meaning in and of itself, then it suggests that the word Santa in the sentence means something. It has some kind of meaning. And so, essentially, what this meaning is a name. It's a meaning which involves the fact that it is a name. It is a name of a thing. Because it is a name, it names a thing. The thing, okay, is Santa. Okay, that thing is Santa itself. Now, the question here, therefore, is that by accepting the proposition Santa does not exist, we are ontologically committed to the idea that things do not exist, that things that do not exist, do exist. Okay, because if we say that something has meaning, And the thing that we're naming here is the name of Santa, and we are naming something. That something is Santa. And so how can we say that it does not exist if we can name it, and then the name of that thing has some kind of meaning? And so we are ontologically committed to the idea that things that don't exist exist. Seems quite paradoxical. How can something which does not exist actually exist? We know that it doesn't exist, but we seem to have to be somehow ontologically committed to its existence. Well, what Quine does is attempt to bring an answer to this by looking at a number of possibilities. Okay, how can we get around this paradox? What ways can we resolve this paradox in a satisfying manner? Well, he outlines two positions a philosopher could take. Both appear to be at least prima facie convincing and reasonable. Prima facie, for those of you who don't know Latin or don't care to ever want to learn Latin, just means on its face. Okay, so often those of you who study law will come across language such as prima facie. So both of these propositions that a philosopher could take that Quine proposes appear to be on their face convincing and reasonable. First one is that Santa is not a concrete object which exists in the concrete world, but rather Santa is something of an idea that exists in everybody's minds. We have a sort of collective memory of what Santa is, and so it could be described as something of an abstract entity. So suggesting that Santa exists does not necessarily entail that we are saying that Santa is an actual character, an actual person that exists in the real concrete world. We could come to the conclusion instead that the existence, the ontological commitment to the existence, is not ontologically committing us to a concrete object, but rather ontologically committing us to an idea in our minds. So Santa does not exist in the real world, but it seems I can have an idea of what Santa is, and that this is a consistent idea that is shared across everybody who understands the basic concept, okay? A jolly man coming down a chimney putting presents under a tree. Now, Quine rejects this viewpoint, that when you are talking about ontological commitments, you can be focusing on maybe concrete versus abstract entities. He argues that it is convincing to suggest that these non-existent objects just exist in our mind and have some kind of mental existence, some kind of mental experience, if you will, some kind of qualia, for example. This is because the whole argument for the existence of non-existent entities is based on our acceptance of the proposition that Santa does not exist. And so as a result of which, nobody is saying that the idea of Santa does not exist. This argument is therefore drawing our attention away from the real philosophical issue to discuss something which is not contentious, okay? So nobody is saying that the idea of Santa does not exist in this proposition. We're saying that Santa does not exist. We are almost intuition pumping a concrete entity into the sentence itself, okay? And so therefore the response in the first proposition isn't very convincing. What about Quine's second response? Well, Quine suggests that that entities such as Santa are what he describes as, quote, unactualized possibility. It's just like any other entity that exists, but instead they lack the properties of actuality and existence. Okay, we will see in a second that Quine has an objection to this as well, but what we see here is that the entity itself we can have an ontological commitment to, and that when we think about ontology and when we think about whether or not something exists and what objects and entities do exist, we are essentially ascribing to those entities the properties of actuality and existence. So just like something like my pencil has the property of being straight, for example, it has a quite hard property. It's orange in terms of the color. These are properties that we can ascribe to a concrete object, okay? It has functional properties, so the function of a pencil, for example, is to write and to draw. But what Quine suggests here in this proposition, in this response, is that all of these concrete objects, this pencil that I'm holding in my hand, for example, doesn't just have these properties that we can ascribe simply, like things like color and consistency and rigidity and all these kinds of things, but it also has the property of actuality and the property of existence. So just like my pencil is orange, it has the property of orangeness, it also has the property of existence and the property of actuality. Okay, and Santa is an example that we can think of as an entity that we have ontological commitments to, in terms of at least the proposition of its lack of existence, and we can have properties that we can ascribe to Santa in terms of being male, being a human, being somebody who goes down a tree at Christmas, being a Christmas character, but that we do not ascribe the property of actuality and existence to this individual. Quine also rejects this proposition, and essentially the proposition that is levied in the second premise, in the second idea, is appealing to a distinction which is made between objects which are actual and those which are possible. Okay, so when we say that Santa doesn't exist, we're not necessarily making a claim about such entities. We are making a claim about things which are possible but not actual. And so what this does is develop a wholly different understanding of the philosophy behind all of these ideas. Because what is happening here is that the argument that is being made is that there are some things which are actual, and that this is just a subset of what is possible. So that when we are talking about making ontological commitments, we might have a whole slew, a whole array of various modal claims that you can make about the possibility of various existing things and things that are potentially actualizable and could be actualizable. And then we go one step deeper and say that there is a subset of things which are possible, and those are the things that are actual. This is an interesting objection that Quine also has. And so as a result of all of this, Quine begins by rejecting the idea that there is a distinction between being and a distinction between existence in this way. And so at the end of the day, what is the difference between something being and something existing? So something in the real world being a thing versus a thing that exists, okay? Quine argues that existence isn't a feature of an object, okay? It is a feature which is lacking by some things, okay? So when I say, for example, that the pencil that I have in my hand has various different properties, it has the property of rigidity, it has the property of being straight, it has the property of being serving a particular function, for example, it has the color property of being orange, and I also made the point that it has the property of being real, or the property of actuality, or the property of existence. Quine argues that this isn't true. Quine argues that existence isn't a feature, it isn't a property of an object. Rather, it is the lack of existence, which is something that is had by things that don't exist, like Santa. So rather than it being a thing that things have, it is the lack of that some things don't have. If that makes any sense at all. Now, ultimately, Quine is saying that conflating the idea of existence with the idea of actuality is actually distorting our traditional notion of the word existence. Okay, and so it is certainly true that we can draw an identity between existence and being using logic. So, for example, if we were to write this particular little piece of first order logic here, what we are saying is that there exists something that is X. That little inverse, reverse, reflected letter E there is known as the existential quantifier. And in first order logic, we use existential and universal quantifiers. The existential quantifier talks about and essentially ascribes a property to the variable there being X, and the property that is being ascribed is the property of existence. It means that there exists something and that thing is X. Okay, the universal quantifier is just an upside down letter A, and that says that for all things X shares some kind of property, for example. Okay, there is an X that has this kinds of property, and that's what first order logic is telling us. Now, it is clearly true that these statements are simply referring to the same thing. And so what we have to think about, therefore, in a little bit more detail in future lessons, is the concept of being able to come up with and develop ontological commitments using logic, using first order logic, and this comes and brings us into the fold one of the Quinean methods of ontological commitments, which is known as the process of regimentation, which we'll get to in future lessons time. Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in metaphysics. We're continuing talking about the subject of ontology in this video, continuing talking about specifically the idea of ontology as developed by philosopher Quine, Quinean ontology. and some of the implications that are had in relation to the development of an ontological series of theories of ontological commitments that lead us down a path where we're starting to talk about various different subsidiary issues in relation to the metaphysics of ontology. Okay, the previous lesson really went into a lot of detail examining the Quinean understanding of ontology. Quine famously wrote a paper titled "On What Exists," and essentially we talk about the method by which Quine addresses some of the major ontological questions, some of the major, what some may consider to be paradoxical elements of ontology. So, for example, how can we show that statements where we are, or propositions where we are suggesting the existence of non-existent objects having some kind of value? And we use the example, the thought experiment of the proposition Santa does not exist, which is almost very paradoxical in a way, because on the one hand, it's a true statement in the sense that Santa does not exist, but on the other hand, if it is true, then it must have some kind of meaning, and it therefore must have some kind of value attached to it. But if we're talking about assigning meaning to a statement which is the truth statement of something that does not exist. We get into some of the ways in which Quine addresses these issues in that previous lesson. This lesson is going to just recap the position by Quine, look at the concept of existence, and then look at the philosophical distinction that exists when we look at the ideas relating to philosophical identity. And that's essentially what we're going to do in this video. So as a basic recap on the concept of non-existent objects, if we look back to the end of the previous lesson, what we did was drew a distinction between the concept of being and the concept of existence. And what we did was we used logic to do so. We used the language of first order logic to make this distinction very, very clear. We used the example in first order logic of the existential quantifier of some kind of variable to suggest that it means that there is some existence of something that is x. Now we use x as a simple placeholder because it is simply representative of a variable, but we're talking here about the existence of something. That's what the existential quantifier does in first order logic. It can be translated in a couple of things, in a couple of ways, should I say. There exists some x, or there is an x that, and then you would, in addition to the existential quantifier attached to a variable, you would probably have further indications of how this logic actually pertains and relates to other to other predicates, to other relations, all these different things here. This isn't a first order logic video, but that's the basic standard of first order logic that we have explored previously. Now, if we want to take this from first order logic and then just reformulate it into something of a philosophical argument that is presented in English, we can look to the metaphysician and philosopher Peter Van Inwagen, should I say, who really looks at this concept and definition of existence. Okay. And what he does in this definition is postulate 5 basic theses that relate to the concept of existence. We're going to look at 4 of these 5 different theses in this video, the 4 being the most important ones. And these are described here as the theses of existence. And he outlines these 4 elements, okay? So he suggests, firstly, that being, okay, is not an activity. What does this mean? Well, he's suggesting here that the concept of being is not something that is a thing that something that is being does. Okay, it is something that is an attributable characteristic of a thing. It is not an activity that the thing does. The second postulate is that being is the same as existence. So there isn't a distinction that is drawn between the idea of being and the idea of existing. The idea of being is the same as the idea of existence. If you are doing one, you are also doing the other. Or let's just say, if you're doing one, that implies it could be an activity. If you have the characteristic of existence, then you have the characteristic of being. The third element is that the idea that existence is univocal, okay? And the idea here that we are presenting here is in conjunction with the previous elements, okay? And when we think of the final one here, we can really start to get this argument and get these postulates that have been presented by Vargan and translate them back into the first order logic that we were looking at previously. He says that the single sense of being or existence, so the idea that being and existence are essentially the same thing, and that being and existence are not activities, they are characteristics, if you will, you can adequately capture and you can adequately explain the nature of being or the nature of existence in the existential quantifier within first order logic, which we looked at in the previous slide, i.e. the reverse little e that we see here that says there is some x, there exists some x. So with that being said, let's just draw our attention to the next major issue, which is this idea of philosophical identity. Okay, it is important that we discuss issues of identity, because when we talk about identity in the context of metaphysics, this will come out of a number of different issues. Okay, this will crop up at multiple other points within our lessons. In fact, there may even be lessons that we do in the future where we spend some time looking specifically at philosophical identity. So, in fact, like I said, the study of identity is an examination of metaphysics in and of itself. So it is a topic of metaphysics that we could do alongside the likes of the philosophy of time, or the likes of the philosophy of ontology, modality, causation, persistence, etc., or free will even. We often have to draw a distinction in philosophy between what we would describe as qualitative identity, which is the weaker form of identity, versus numerical identity, which is the strongest form of philosophical identity. When we say that two things are metaphysically identical, when we talk about identity essentially within the broader context of philosophy and the broader context of metaphysics, okay, we are referring to numerical identity. If we say that A equals B and that A and B are metaphysically identical, we are saying that they are numerically identical. This essentially tells us that A and B are one in the same, okay? They don't share qualitative features or characteristics in the sense that they're two different things that maybe look similar or maybe behave in similar ways. They are numerically identical in the sense that they are literally one in the same thing. You may have two different names for the same object. So, for example, the idea that the North Star and Venus, okay, are numerically identical. The reason why is because in language we are referring to two different things technically, or at least we're making two different statements in language, but in reality we are talking about the exact same thing, the thing in the sky that is both the North Star and the planet Venus. They just happen to be the same thing with two different names. That's what numerical identity tells us. So essentially what we have here are two different entities, but they may both represent the same thing. The two different entities may be the two different ways in which we can name said entities, but they're both representing the same thing. When we talk about identity in relation to common parlance, however, and the sort of colloquial understanding of identity, we are often referring to something known as qualitative identity. This is a weaker definition. This accepts that the view that A and B may refer to two distinct things, but that these two things share a commonality. They share an identity in the fact that they are qualitatively similar. They share similar qualities. This would be the case if you had, for example, two pens that are identical to each other. Okay, there are two pens. I've got two pens in my hand. They both come from the same packet of ballpoint pens that I bought a few months ago. Okay, so they are both of the same design. You could not tell them apart. Okay, but they are only qualitatively similar because they are still two distinct things. I can hold one in one hand. I can hold one in the other hand. One can exist in this plane of existence over here in this space. The other can exist in a different space over here. Okay, they're not numerically identical. They're not one and the same. They're still two distinct things despite having the same qualities, being qualitatively the same. Another example is that, in a weaker instance, is that if I have a Ford Focus which is green and I have another one which is also green, we would say that these are two Ford Focuses which are green. But they're not numerically identical. They're not numerically identical in the sense that they are one in the same car. We're saying that they share similar qualities. They have the quality of being a car that we would classify as being a Ford Focus, the characteristics of a Ford Focus, and also the characteristics of the color, the characteristics of greenness that is attributable to both of these. But they're still different. They're still different cars. They are just qualitatively identical. So it's important that we just take a brief minute to think about that, and when we get into looking at metaphysics in future lessons time, I will refer back to these concepts of identity and refer back to these concepts of ontology and all of these different ideas, because when we get into looking at other areas in metaphysics, these things start to crop up again. And that's one of the things that is important about metaphysics, is that they're often not distinct subtopics. For example, ontology will be shown to exist and be shown to have very important implications in all of the other branches of metaphysics, in a lot of different branches of philosophy more generally.